is science political? All the people working in critical science studies, they're absolutely making these claims that science has politics, and we should be thinking about that. Arguably, science has always been political. The classic view, the classic myth, I guess we tell of the sciences, right? You go back to the scientific revolution, and there's this story we sort of tell of, some brave scientists that are, willing to speak truth to power, that come into conflict with sort of a classic worldview and, the Catholic Church in particular. And what you see is this kind of progressive anti-authoritarian break with entrenched ideas and arrangements, and the brave free scientist is speaking out and arguing on behalf of truth. That's sort of the classic view I think we have of the sciences, and definitely of the scientific revolution. And I guess as a political movement there, you can see science as anti-authoritarian, as somewhat anarchist in a way, is very progressive. This is the Enlightenment image of the sciences, right? Things change quite dramatically, post the scientific revolution, right? You look at the 19th century, and you look at the development of Romanticism in the arts and humanities and whatnot, right? And there, the Romantists saw science actually as, not a progressive political movement, but really as an overly stifling movement, as something relatively conservative, as giving us this image of humanity as a kind of machine, and the universe as a machine, and sort of taking the dignity out of humanity. The Marxists saw science as oppressive, as reinforcing, social and economic inequality. So it's not like science has always been thought of as a progressive institution, but historically, I think largely science has been seen as a progressive movement. Now, this changes, again, at least within the science studies community. We see a major shift in the image of the sciences occur in the second half of the 20th century. You see things like the science wars show up, which is like this conflict between the humanities and the sciences. And people start talking about science as conservative as opposed to progressive. Science comes to be seen as one of the many forces that maintain status quo, particularly inequalities. It is often seen by people working in this area as, one of many arms of the colonialist movement, right? Some progressive thinkers begin treating science as part of a much larger multi-tentacled political structure that reinforces subtle forms of exclusion and coercion. It gets, the scientist, the scientific community gets to decide whose voices are heard, whose truth is the real truth. Science begins getting seen as one arm of colonialism here, right? So rather than as a sort of progressive, world-changing thing that makes us more egalitarian and freer, science begins getting accused of being, part of a system that reinforces the status quo, excludes others, privileges others. Now, pointing out these connections between scientific institutions and political power is not necessarily to be like anti-science, right? It's not like people that were doing science studies, or even that do science studies today, are anti-science. Most of them love the sciences. They're passionately interested in them, right? And so that's often why they're engaged in science studies. But as with any criticism, I think one of the goals of the people that were doing science studies is you're trying to draw attention to things, trying to make change, right? You're not sort of rejecting science as a good thing in the world. You're just saying, look, science is much more complicated. It's not simply like science is freeing us. There's all these sort of negative things about science as an institution as well that are worth drawing attention to. Maybe those can be changed. Now, there's lots of trends that led to sort of the development of science studies and of people looking at the sciences from this kind of political and critical lens. One thing, just Thomas Kuhn, right? He opens up the space for this, right? Throughout this course, what we've seen so far is we've seen people trying to sort of give, well, what's the formal method of the sciences, right? How does science work? And, they've been, they haven't been critical of science per se. What they've been doing is they've been trying to give a formalized model of how it is that scientific reasoning works so well and how it is that it allows us to come to truth. So they've been very much on board with the general scientific project. And then what you see in Thomas Kuhn, right, is you see Kuhn say, look, that works sort of missing what's really interesting about science. Science is a human project, just like anything else, right? Science is an activity that humans engage in. And science is very much a part of our culture and our time and our historical moment in the same way that any other institutions we build are. And as such, it's it's prone to the kinds of biases, political, social, economic, that we all have. And so it can be understood as a historical phenomenon, as a cultural artifact, and as something that changes with the times, right? And I mean, Kuhn's work, one of the things it does is it opens up this door for sort of going, okay, well, science is, a human institution. It's something we create, and it's a product of our cultures. Well, it's something we can critique in the same way that we can critique any other part of our culture, right? And so post Kuhn, you still have this kind of traditional philosophical project. How do we formalize the sciences? That's still going on. It's going on today. But you see this other kind of movement that involves a lot more people working in fields like communication studies or history or anthropology or cultural studies or even English departments, where they start looking at science as an institution, as a text, as a thing that we create at a moment in time, and that it's prone to and can be understood in terms of the kind of biases and commitments that any other part of our culture has. Now, we should see science studies and the critique of science is sort of contained here as part of a larger trend. This is sort of going on right across academia in the late 20th century. So it's not like these people are just picking on science. What you see, I guess, emerge in the later 20th century is a lot of people taking theoretical perspectives, whether it's feminist perspective, queer theory, critical race theory, Marxist theory, any of these other kinds of approaches, and applying them, just straight across the board to cultures, trying to understand, well, how is it that this cultural institution has, what does this cultural institution say about sex and gender? What does it say about women? What does it do to women? What does it say about race? What does it do to race? What are the kind of racial assumptions built right into this kind of framework, if any? That's what critical theorists are doing. But again, not just attacking science, and attack's the wrong word, but they're not just studying science. You see this all over the place in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So for example, if we were doing like a legal theory course, right, you would run into probably several weeks where you would do critical legal studies, and you'd look at the same kinds of things there, right? You'd look at queer approaches to the law, or critical race theory as it applies to the law, or feminist theory as it applies to the law, right? Because there's this sort of this myth in a lot of our institutions, whether it's the legal system, the economic system, or science or education, right, that all people are exactly the same. And this institution takes any random person and it'll spit them out. And if they do their work, they'll come out, right? Like education, that's what we do. We take like, sort of a naive view of education. You take a child, throw them through the education system, and we'll spit out an adult. And they all have the same kind of education. They've had the same kind of opportunities, and they've been transformed in the same kind of ways, right? But there's this sort of idea there that the child is just like this amorphous blank slate. Like there's just the child, they come through education, they're transformed. University does the same thing. The legal system, right? You come into the legal system, your particulars don't really matter. The justice is impartial, justice is blind. The system treats everyone the same, and it's fair that way, right? That's the idea. And one of the things that critical studies is doing is saying, well, actually, look, these institutions, I mean, two things you might say. One, these institutions have built right within them assumptions about what, say, normal is, or what this kind of idealized person proceeding through the system is like. And typically that's going to be, on a model of a white male, right, is typically the claim. And so what something like a feminist critique of the law would be like is, does the legal system treat women differently than it does men? Does white men, does it have different results for women than it does for men? Are there certain kinds of biases in the legal system that don't sort of account for the particularities of a woman, right? Those are the kinds of claims you'd see in critical studies. And then directly related to that is this idea that we're not all the same, that there's big differences possibly between somebody that, identifies as, gay or bi or pan or trans than there is somebody that identifies as cisgendered, right? Um, Now that's of course a controversial claim, but I mean the idea is just like we're not all the same. Institutions are going to interact with us in very different ways, and if an institution is not sort of like consciously aware of that in its design and its intent, then it might be, you know, unconsciously or unintentionally biased in specific ways, or it might reinforce certain kinds of ideas about certain types of people. And that's often the kind of claims or work that's being done here, right? As people are looking at complexity around things like race and economic class and gender. So let's look at sort of how somebody in critical studies might approach science. There's a number of different critiques. We're going to leave like a feminist critique to the side for a while. We're just going to like, well, what other kinds of things might you say about the sciences, right? So one very common critique of science by the science studies people was what's called the cultural critique. So some interpreters of Kuhn said, look, Thomas Kuhn implies that a scientific paradigm is just one hat or one perspective on reality. It's not sort of like a privileged access to the truth, and it's a myth we tell, right? Like when we looked at Kuhn, one of the ways of interpreting Thomas Kuhn is that truth is always relative to a paradigm, and that might mean that truth is radically subjective, that the things we say are true simply or only because of the sort of the commitments, the assumptions we bring to the table. We construct truth in some way. Kuhn says that kind of thing at times. It's not clear if he himself believed that, but he definitely says things that lend themselves to that interpretation. But so you might look at somebody like Kuhn and go, look, science is just one set of truths. It's just one way of looking at the world, but there are other truths. There are other paradigms. Even science itself has had radically different paradigms. And these paradigms are incommensurable, right? Going back to Kuhn, says you can't compare paradigms because our paradigms give us our standards of what's true or false, what's a good argument, what's a bad argument, what evidence is. And so if you take one paradigm, of course, my paradigm is going to say that this other way of looking at the world is wrong and false. But that's just because of the assumptions that are built right into my paradigm. So I can't really get, says Kuhn, this perspective of nowhere from which to evaluate two or more competing paradigms and say this one's better than the others. And so what we're stuck is we're always stuck in our worldview. We're evaluating from a perspective. But if that's true, say some interpretations of Kuhn, well then science, just like everything else, is just one set of hats that we look at the world through. I think glasses are a better analogy, right? You think about putting on your science filtered lenses, right? You put on your science glasses and reality will look a certain way from that perspective. But it's not like that way is necessarily more accurate than say if you put on your, I don't know, your scholastic glasses. It's just you're filtering the stuff, the real, assuming there is a real, in a, through a different kinds of lens, and so you're going to say different kinds of things about it. But it's not like, says Kuhn, we can sort of go, well, which pair of glasses is better? They're just radically different, and they contain within them the tools for evaluating each other. So of course, from my perspective, I'm going to say, well, my way is better, but that's from within a perspective, right? And so a science studies person sort of on board with this way of thinking might say something like, well, look, science is just one of many perspectives. It's not a special way of looking at reality. It's not like science is giving us truths that are more objective or more universal than other ways of thinking. They're just one way of carving up reality. And then we might sort of start challenging sort of the cultural status of science there, right? And we say, look, if science itself is just one of many local traditions, sciences are the local traditions that emerged in the European world and prospered in North America. They emerged roughly around the scientific revolution, had roots in ancient Greece and Rome, and then they were very much the worldview that North Americans or the Europeans sort of like exported worldwide, right, during the colonial era. And as such, they express and promote a very Eurocentric worldview. And then we might be concerned because, given that the scientific worldview is displacing and replacing older knowledge traditions, this might not always be a good thing. In fact, you could go further and you could say something like, well, science itself might be a form of European colonialism that has unintended negative effects, or possibly intended negative effects, right? So there's one way you might critique the sciences, right? Is you might say, hey, look, the sciences as we've understood them, the current paradigm is one way of imposing a certain kind of worldview on the rest of the world, but that worldview doesn't have any sort of right to claim more authority than any other way of thinking. That's one kind of critique. You might have a more applied critique that makes very similar kinds of claims, right? It turns out that when we import new science-based technologies to societies with little previous exposure to them, and often very different environments than sort of these technologies were built in, the effects can often be failures or even destructive. We've seen this in attempts to engage in aid and development worldwide, right? Especially aid coming from the first world to the third world, right? And there's loads of examples of this. And so one thing somebody in science studies might just do is just point these types of things out. So for example, attempts to bring science-based agricultural practices to the Balinese largely failed. They had a different cultural context, they had different environmental conditions. And so then you're bringing, hey, look, well, let's bring in these agriculture techniques that work really well in North America, and let's impose them on you because that'll up your production and you'll have a better crop yield and your people will do better. And actually, often what happened in this case is, well, the exact opposite, right? What you see is unanticipated negative environmental consequences that the traditional practices had learned to avoid. Somebody might claim, well, there's just sort of pieces of information that the scientific worldview wasn't aware of, right? When they sort of imposed these technologies, and had they been more careful, they would have realized things. But the thought is, well, look, what happens is you've sort of got this existing cultural framework, and you've got this existing knowledge tradition, and a lot of it is mythological, right? A lot of it is tied to local wisdom or local knowledge, or and people say things, well, don't do this because the gods will be angered or something. And of course, the scientist claim goes, that's ridiculous. There's no gods to be angered. Let's just do this. But what is often lost there is, well, there's a reason why there's this claim about the gods being angered, right? It might have implied something about certain kinds of soil or certain kinds of weather patterns that we're sort of not aware to be not taken seriously by the person imposing the new technologies, right? And so often what happens is, best of intentions, what you're doing is you're sort of destroying an existing ecosystem, or you're missing really important pieces of information that you should have paid attention to, and arguably you would have had you sort of given more credence to the existing knowledge tradition that you're displacing, is the claim here, right? Some people have even gone so far as to claim that these innovations are a means of cultural domination and economic exploitation, right? And then they appeal to things where you say, look, what often happens, in the name of aid, or technological improvement or advancement, is that you see often first world corporations, or often first world corporations going in and seizing control over what were once local resources, right? So 2 examples of this, right? Suppose you go and you're a scientist and you go in and you look at you look at some traditional herbs, right? In rainforest, and people have like myths about the local shamans or whatever have myths about these being magic or medicine or whatever. And so you go in as a scientist and you go, wow, that's not science, right? Like, you don't really, you got all these myths. What we're going to do is we're going to test these things. We're going to test them properly. We're going to use, traditional science and experimentation. We're going to be careful, and then we're going to know whether or not these herbs actually work. And lo and behold, maybe 2 of the 12 herbs actually show positive results on like, kind of a traditional scientific method, well, then what you do, right, is you say, hey, look, well, we did the research and we are now patenting this. So, a local medical tradition, right, this shamanic medicine is now patented and owned by the corporation and the scientists that did the work to prove from their perspective that this medicine worked, even though the local tradition already claimed that this stuff worked, right? But now they don't own it anymore. This corporation has patented, right? So these research think tanks now own the local medicine, right? And so that you might say, hey, well, actually, this is just a way of imposing cultural dominance and economic exploitation of a local community. That's the kind of critique here, right? Or, people often accuse Monsanto's GMO patented seeds of doing this, right? Because, Monsanto owns the seeds. So, you get some of your Monsanto, genetically modified seeds into your field. Now they have a patent claim to your crop, right? And you might say, yeah, but we were fine. And then you just came in here and, we didn't really ask for this, but now you claim you own our agriculture output. So this is another kind of critique of the sciences, right? Is, often when we're engaged in applying technologies worldwide, what we see is negative consequences for locally existing traditions, and sometimes just a usurping of resources and knowledge that was already sort of held by the local community. That's the claim. And I think I'm going into more detail on this issue in this slide here, right? Yes, so I mean, the worry when people have this kind of claim against the sciences is what we often see is a very one-sided exploitive relationship in which things like biopiracy or bioprospecting are conducted. And this is what I was talking about with somebody coming in and taking traditional knowledge claims about like traditional medicine or magic, and then sort of demonstrating via scientific methods that it actually works, patented it, and now claiming to own it and claiming that I, as the company that came in and did the research on your magic crops, I now know it works and I own it. You didn't actually do anything to this. You don't have any right for this. It's my company that gets the profit, not your local community, right? And the thought here is, look, this is a relationship not of sort of cultural exchange and learning between the scientists and sort of the local traditions, but one of improving the practices and exploiting what they have. The idea is not so much learning from traditional knowledge, but rather skeptically testing the claims of non-scientific approaches. And if by some fluke the non-scientific approaches, have latched onto something that works, well, it's not because they knew this, because they didn't, because they're not doing science. So we now claim it as our own because we went in with science, so says the science tradition, and now we own it, right? That's the critique here. And again, you can think of these whatever you want. I'm just trying to go through. Here's some very sort of standard ways somebody might critique the science from various kind of perspectives. Another perspective you might take is the ecological critique. This would go further than a cultural critique. An ecological critique would say that by discarding or displacing traditional or local knowledge in favor of the march of science and progress, we often lose things that were already known by more holistic, less analytic methods. Somebody might say, look, the sciences are mechanistic. They understand the whole by looking at the parts and how they interact. But maybe that is to miss things. Maybe there are times that the behavior of a whole is best explained in terms of the properties of the whole. This is especially true of dynamic systems. Now, this is complicated because one of the trends in contemporary science is very much a move towards dynamic modeling. So how do we say this? Traditionally, science sort of like approached the world, and we're looking for causes and we're looking for effects, right? So you find an effect in the world and you go, well, what caused this? You try to isolate that cause and you go, okay, so this is what's doing the work here. What we're seeing more and more in contemporary science is a move towards dynamic modeling of systems. And here, when you do a dynamic model, what you're saying is, look, I'm looking at something that's really complicated. An environment, for example, or a society or an ecosystem or an organism or a mind, perhaps. These are not simple things where it's like there's one cause that's leading to an effect. Rather, what they are is really complex environments or models where there's a whole bunch of things that are all working on each other always. And the way in which those interact with each other is holistic. It is quite complicated, right? Like, suppose you have an environment where you have three things. You've got predators, you've got prey, and then you've got some plants, right? And you want to know, okay, now why are the plants dying out here? You might say, well, there's too many prey, right? That's sort of like an old school kind of story. You might say, well, look, that's too simple. We've got three things. We've got prey, we've got predators, and we've got plants, and they all interact with each other, and they all sort of maintain a certain kind of homeostasis or something, like they maintain a balance. And if you affect, and they're always impacting each other. So it's not like it's just like one factor that's doing the work here. It's all three of them always, sort of always working on each other. And if you change one of them whatsoever, the others will change as well simultaneously at the same time, right? And so it's a mistake to be able to say, hey, I can just isolate this one factor and that'll account for everything. No, 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 it's everything always at once. That's probably not the best explanation, but a model is holistic. A model has a bunch of different factors that are all simultaneously interacting with each other and transforming each other simultaneously always, right? And so in a model, you can't really take one thing out and go, that's the cause of this. It's always complicated. And the ecological critique is, look, local knowledge traditions they're not mechanistic typically. They're holistic. They're the kinds of things where they say, look, all this stuff works together. And so a holistic account of how things work, often local knowledge traditions are sort of, they fit better with this modeling kind of idea than sort of old school mechanistic science does. And so here the critique is often what sort of has happened is when you bring in a science tradition and sort of displaces a local knowledge, there's actually lots that gets lost, that gets simplified in ways that are sometimes harmful or sometimes they're just false. And maybe what we need to do is we need to take this broader kind of perspective, right? Traditional analytic science seems to work best when there's a single underlying cause of the phenomenon. A specific bacteria or virus causes a disease. Insulin treats diabetes, etc., right? But when causes are more complex, like the relationship between the animals in an environment or a climate, right, or a mine, possibly something like cancer, right? Traditional analytic approaches tend to break down because they tend to systematically neglect the complex relationships that sort of give a more accurate account of what's actually happening. And this often leads to distorted representations of important aspects of the causal structure of the world. And then that can have unexpected and undesired consequences. And so ecological critiques say, look, things are more complicated, and a lot of non-science traditions have recognized that. And you bring science in, it often simplifies in ways that are false or destructive or bad. And that's the kind of critique here. What comes out of this? I mean, push towards more dynamic models, right? The claim is not, oh, science bad. It's, well, why don't we look at this in a more holistic way? Why don't we look at this in a more dynamic way? Maybe that'll give us a more accurate account of the real.